Meditations? Marcus Aurelius. There is a paradox that almost no one teaches us to face. The more we try to control life, the more restless we become. We chase stability, recognition, and emotional security, yet the mind remains agitated. Perhaps the problem is not in the external world but in the way we relate to it. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful men in history, discovered this early, or perhaps at exactly the right moment. What is striking is that he did not write his reflections in times of peace or comfort. He wrote amid wars, illness, loss, and overwhelming responsibility. And yet his meditations do not speak of despair but of clarity. They do not speak of escape but of presence. This forces us to confront a silent belief. Do we really need ideal conditions in order to live well? Or does inner peace arise from somewhere else? We live in an era that promises happiness as a product, control as a goal, and success as an identity. And yet, deep down, many people carry a persistent sense of emptiness, anxiety, and disconnection. Marcus Aurelius offers a radically simple and profound alternative: turn inward. Not to withdraw from the world, but to learn how to inhabit it with awareness, reason, and virtue. Meditations is not a book to be read quickly. It is a mirror. It confronts us with our automatic reactions, our attachments, our silent fears. At the same time, it offers something rare: a practical path of inner growth, applicable to real life, daily conflicts, and the small choices that shape who we become. Throughout this video, we will not merely analyze a work of ancient wisdom. We will move through a journey of personal reflection, self-mastery, and reconnection with what is essential. You may not leave with all the answers, but if you allow it, you may leave with better questions, those that quietly transform the way we live. An introduction to the Stoic wisdom of Marcus Aurelius. When I open Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, I do not feel as though I am holding an ordinary book. It feels as if I am listening to someone speak to himself in a moment of deep silence, far from audiences and applause. And that, curiously, creates a rare intimacy. This is not a philosopher trying to convince the world. It is a man trying not to lose himself. A Roman emperor, surrounded by power, wars, and irreversible decisions, writing to remember who he needed to be when no one was watching. That alone says a great deal about Stoic philosophy. Marcus Aurelius did not write to teach, he wrote to survive inwardly. And perhaps that is why his words cross centuries with such force. He ruled the greatest empire of the known world, yet he knew that no position protects the mind from fear, doubt, or emotional exhaustion. As I read his reflections, I noticed something both uncomfortable and liberating at the same time. Our inner conflicts are not modern. They have merely changed clothes. The stage is different, but the human drama is the same. The Stoicism that emerges here is not a cold or distant philosophy, as many imagine. On the contrary, it is a practical, almost therapeutic philosophy, oriented toward self-knowledge and inner growth. Marcus Aurelius writes to remind himself to act with virtue when everything around him invites impulsive reaction. He writes to maintain emotional control when the world demands quick answers. And reading this today, I feel as though he is speaking directly to me, and perhaps to you as well. There is something deeply human in recognizing that even an emperor needed daily reminders not to become a prisoner of his own emotions. This dismantles the modern fantasy that external success automatically brings inner harmony. It does not. Marcus Aurelius knew this. That is why his meditations are a continuous exercise in awareness, a daily training in self-mastery, almost like someone who constantly returns to the basics so as not to get lost in excess. I like to think of this book as a silent mirror. It does not shout answers, promise shortcuts, or sell instant happiness. It invites personal reflection. And it does so honestly, sometimes even harshly. Marcus Aurelius reminds us that life is impermanence, that everything passes, including power, recognition, and the conflicts that today seem gigantic. When this idea truly sinks in, something changes in the way we prioritize what matters. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of this introduction to ancient wisdom is realizing that Marcus Aurelius did not separate spirituality from action. For him, to live well was to live aligned with universal reason, with the nature of things, without dramatizing what cannot be controlled. This requires a deep level of self-mastery, something that does not arise from theory but from daily practice. A silent, intimate practice, carried out in the space between an automatic thought and a conscious choice. When I bring this into everyday life, I notice how much we react on autopilot. A sharp comment, a frustration at work, an unexpected delay, everything becomes a trigger for emotional wear. Marcus Aurelius would teach us to pause, to ask, does this really deserve my energy? Is this under my control? This simple question, asked honestly, already begins to reorganize the mind. It is practical philosophy applied to real life. There is also a strong sense of humility in the meditations. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminds himself of his human condition, his finitude, and his moral responsibility toward others. He does not write to elevate himself, but to align himself. And this makes me reflect on how often we seek external validation when, in truth, what we need is internal coherence. A virtuous life begins when no one is watching. This first contact with Stoic philosophy reveals something essential. We do not control the world, but we can choose how we position ourselves within it. This choice, repeated every day, builds character, emotional resilience, and a sense of inner dignity that does not depend on applause. Marcus Aurelius knew that true power lies not in ruling territories, but in governing one's own mind. And it is precisely here that something begins to move inside us. Because when we understand who Marcus Aurelius was and why he wrote these reflections, a silent question arises. If even he needed to learn to accept the limits of life, what are we still resisting accepting? This unease is not comfortable, but it prepares the ground for something even deeper. The awareness of impermanence and the impact it has on everything we value. The art of accepting impermanence. There is a moment, almost always silent, when the idea of impermanence stops being a beautiful concept and becomes a real discomfort. Marcus Aurelius spoke often about this in Meditations, not as someone fascinated by death, but as someone deeply committed to life. He knew that remembering finitude does not paralyze us, it awakens us. When I accept that everything changes, including myself, I begin to live with greater clarity and less attachment to what I cannot hold. For a long time, I myself resisted this idea. The human mind likes stability, promises of permanence, and guarantees. But life does not sign that contract. Marcus Aurelius invites us to look at this truth without dramatizing it. Nothing that exists is outside the flow of impermanence. Bodies, positions, relationships, emotions, phases of life. When I stop fighting this, something curious happens. Suffering diminishes. Not because losses disappear, but because the internal shock softens. Stoic philosophy teaches us that remembering death is not morbid. It is alignment. It places things in perspective. When I bring finitude to the center of awareness, what is superficial loses strength. That argument that seemed enormous shrinks. That anxiety about the future loses some of its power. Impermanence reorganizes priorities. It asks me, firmly yet gently, will what consumes you today still matter in a year? Or even tomorrow? Marcus Aurelius practiced this exercise almost daily. He reminded himself that everything that is born is destined to change. And that includes pain, failure, and difficult emotional states. How often do we believe that a bad moment will last forever? Stoicism offers a simple and profound antidote. Observe, accept, and move through it. Emotions are like clouds. We are not required to expel them, only not to confuse them with the entire sky. In daily life, accepting impermanence is a training in presence. It is realizing that the present moment is all that truly exists. Yesterday has already passed. Tomorrow has not yet arrived. Marcus Aurelius insisted on this because he knew how easily the mind wanders. When I am stuck in the past, I live in regret. When I obsess over the future, I live in anxiety. Awareness of the now brings me back to center. And that return is deeply liberating. A simple exercise I learned from this reading is to ask, in moments of tension, will this pass too? Not as an escape, but as an anchor. This question breaks mental rigidity. It restores movement to what seems stuck. It is a reminder that nothing is absolute, not even pain. Practiced over time, this builds emotional resilience in a quiet and consistent way. Marcus Aurelius also warns us about attachment to expectations. Often we suffer not because of what happens, but because of what we thought should happen. Impermanence dismantles these illusions. It invites us to deal with reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. This requires inner maturity, but it brings a rare peace. When I stop negotiating with the inevitable, the mind relaxes. There is a hidden beauty in this acceptance. When everything is temporary, each experience gains value. A simple meeting, a shared silence, an honest conversation. Everything becomes more vivid when it is not treated as guaranteed. Marcus Aurelius saw this as an invitation to active gratitude. Not naive gratitude, but conscious gratitude. The gratitude of someone who knows that nothing is permanent and, precisely for that reason, everything is precious. This awareness also makes us more humane toward others. If we are all moving through an unstable world, perhaps we can judge less and understand more. Impermanence equalizes us. Emperors and ordinary citizens alike, all subject to the same laws of nature. This understanding softens coexistence and deepens our perception of life in society. And when this truth begins to settle, something opens internally. Because if everything passes, an inevitable question arises: where then should I place my energy? What truly deserves my care, my attention, and my daily choices? It is at this point that reflection ceases to be merely contemplative, and begins to touch directly on personal responsibility and on what is, in fact, under our control. Control is within you. There is a quiet shift that happens when we truly understand what Marcus Aurelius meant by control. This is not an intellectual understanding, something we agree with in theory and forget the next day. It is a realization that moves us internally. In Meditations, he insists on a point that seems simple, yet changes everything. There are things that depend on us, and things that do not. Confusing these two categories is one of the greatest sources of human suffering. I see this clearly when I observe how much we try to control what lies beyond our reach. The opinions of others, the behavior of those we love, recognition at work, the rhythm of life itself. We expend energy trying to hold the wind. Marcus Aurelius invites us to a wiser choice. Invest in what truly lies under our authority: our judgments, our actions, our inner posture toward events. Stoic philosophy does not promise that life will be fair or comfortable. It promises something more honest: inner freedom. When I understand that I do not control events, but I do control how I respond to them, something reorganizes itself. Anxiety decreases. Frustration loses strength. Not because problems disappear, but because they no longer invade the space of my identity. They become events, not verdicts about who I am. This principle becomes very practical in everyday life. Imagine a common situation. Someone treats you rudely. The automatic reaction is to respond in kind or to ruminate on it for hours. Marcus Aurelius would suggest a pause. The other person's rudeness does not depend on you, but your response does. You can choose not to absorb it as truth. That space between stimulus and response is where self-mastery lives. I myself had to train this consciously. At first, it felt almost artificial, taking a deep breath, observing the impulse, choosing a different attitude. But over time, this training becomes character. The mind learns that it does not need to react to everything. This is a profound form of emotional control. It is not repression, it is awareness. It is understanding that not every thought deserves action, and not every emotion needs to be followed. Marcus Aurelius spoke often about not becoming a slave to one's own perceptions. Many times we do not suffer because of facts, but because of the stories we tell about them. A delay becomes disrespect. Silence becomes rejection. A mistake becomes total failure. Stoicism teaches us to question these internal narratives. What is fact? What is interpretation? This distinction completely transforms our relationship with reality. A simple yet powerful exercise is to name things as they are. Instead of saying, "This is horrible," say, "This is uncomfortable." Instead of, "I can't stand this," say, "This is difficult but bearable." This shift in language reorganizes consciousness. It may seem like a detail, but it is not. The way we describe experience shapes the experience itself. Marcus Aurelius did this constantly in his reflections. When we take responsibility for what lies under our control, something curious happens. The sense of victimhood begins to weaken. Not because life becomes easy, but because we reclaim inner agency. We are no longer pushed around by events, we move alongside them. This posture generates a quiet strength, an emotional resilience that does not depend on favorable circumstances. This also teaches us to let go of what does not belong to us. How often do we carry problems that are not ours? Other people's emotions, external expectations, social pressures. Marcus Aurelius would remind us, tend your own field. Do well what is yours to do. The rest is not under your dominion. This clarity brings lightness, not a naive lightness but a mature one, grounded in reason. And when this distinction becomes clear, a new challenge naturally arises. If control is within me, then I am responsible for what I do with it, my choices, my values, my conduct. This leads us directly to a deeper question. If I cannot control everything, how should I live well within what I can? It is here that reflection begins to point towards something essential: virtue as the axis of life. Mastering emotions and passions. There is a common misunderstanding about Stoicism that must be dissolved from the start. Mastering emotions does not mean eliminating them. Marcus Aurelius never proposed a cold or anesthetized life. On the contrary, he knew that feeling is inevitable. The real work lies in not being dragged by emotions like someone who loses the rudder in the middle of a storm. In Meditations, he writes to remind himself to remain lucid when emotion threatens to take command. I see how current this is when I observe the speed at which we react today. Everything is immediate, the response, the outrage, the impulse. We feel something and, almost without noticing, we are already acting from it. Stoicism enters as a conscious break. Not to block the feeling, but to create an inner space of observation. In that space, self-mastery is born, and it completely changes the quality of our decisions. Marcus Aurelius understood that intense emotions distort judgment. Anger, fear, excessive desire, all of them narrow perception. When we are dominated by a passion, we see only part of reality. That is why he insisted so much on mental clarity. Keeping reason active is not denying feeling. It is preventing feeling from becoming a tyrant. This is one of the deepest keys of practical Stoic philosophy. In everyday life, this appears in very simple situations. An unexpected criticism, for example. The impulse is to defend oneself or to attack. But when I observe the emotion before acting, something changes. I can ask, is this true? Does this define me? Do I need to respond right now? Often, emotion demands urgency. Wisdom asks for time. This small interval is an act of emotional control and self-respect. Marcus Aurelius also reminds us that many passions arise from unrealistic expectations. We expect people to behave as we would like, life to follow our plans, the world to be fair all the time. When this does not happen, frustration emerges. Stoicism invites us to adjust expectation to the nature of things. People make mistakes. Life changes. Accepting this reduces internal friction and strengthens emotional resilience. A practical exercise I often use is to name the emotion without merging with it. Instead of saying, I am anxious, I say, I am feeling anxiety. This difference may seem subtle, but it is powerful. It brings awareness back to the center. The emotion becomes an experience, not an identity. Marcus Aurelius did this intuitively in his writing. He observed the mind as one observes a river, without trying to force it to stop. Another essential point is understanding that we are not responsible for the emergence of emotions, but we are responsible for what we do with them. The first impulse is not a choice. The second already is. This distinction brings freedom. I do not need to blame myself for feeling anger, but I can choose not to act from it. This posture builds a more internally harmonized life, less hostage to emotional explosions. Marcus Aurelius spoke often about not feeding useless thoughts, repetitive thoughts, catastrophic scenarios, imaginary dialogues. All of these intensify negative emotions. A simple Stoic practice is to interrupt this cycle consciously. Return to the body, to the breath, to the present moment. Not as an escape, but as an anchor. The mind gradually learns not to dramatize everything. Over time, this training creates a rare inner stability. It is not apathy, it is balance. Emotion arises, is recognized, passes through, and leaves. This fluidity reduces mental wear and improves our relationships. When we do not react automatically, we open space for responses that are fairer, more humane, and more aligned with our values. And as this inner mastery strengthens, an inevitable question arises. If I am not governed by emotions, then what should guide my choices? What remains steady when mood fluctuates, when the world shakes, when passions lose their force? It is at this point that Marcus Aurelius points to something even more solid. Virtue as the compass of life. Virtue as the supreme aim. At some point in life, almost all of us realize that acquiring things is not the same as acquiring peace. Marcus Aurelius already knew this nearly 2,000 years ago. In Meditations, he constantly returns to a central idea. Virtue is not a means to something else. It is the end itself. To live well, for him, did not mean accumulating power, comfort, or recognition, but aligning actions and values so coherently that the conscience could rest. Stoic philosophy defines virtue in a very practical way. It is neither rigid moralism nor unattainable perfectionism. Virtue is acting with wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, even when no one is watching. It is doing what needs to be done without depending on applause. Marcus Aurelius wrote this for himself because he knew how much the ego feeds on external validation. Virtue, on the other hand, sustains itself. I like to think of virtue as an inner compass. Emotions fluctuate. Circumstances change. External opinions shift. But when the compass is calibrated, we know where to go, even amid confusion. Marcus Aurelius understood that a virtuous life does not eliminate problems, but it prevents them from corrupting us from within. And in the long run, this is a profound form of freedom. In everyday life, this idea becomes very concrete. Acting with justice, for example, may mean not responding to an injustice with another injustice. It may mean telling the truth even when it would be easier to omit it. Courage is often not a grand heroic act, but the willingness to stand by a difficult decision. Temperance appears when we know when to stop, when we do not exaggerate, when we do not allow ourselves to be dominated by excess. Marcus Aurelius also reminds us that virtue does not depend on circumstances. Even in adverse situations, we can still choose to act rightly. This idea is powerful because it restores autonomy to the conscience. No matter what happens to us, there is always an ethical choice available. This thought completely changes our relationship with suffering. Pain may be inevitable, but moral degradation is not. A practical exercise I often apply is to ask, when facing a decision, is this aligned with who I want to be? Not with the immediate outcome, but with the character I am building. This simple question shifts the focus from external gain to internal integrity. Marcus Aurelius made this move constantly. He wrote to remind himself that the value of life lies in the quality of action, not in the approval it receives. There is also a serenity that arises from a virtuous life. When I know I did what was within my reach, I sleep better. The mind rests because it does not need to justify inconsistencies. This kind of peace does not depend on visible achievements. It is born from alignment between thought, word, and action. Stoic philosophy calls this living in accordance with nature. Not external nature, but the rational nature of the human being. Marcus Aurelius saw virtue as something trained daily, through small choices. It is not a permanent state, it is a constant commitment. We err, we notice, we adjust. This process requires humility and awareness. It is not about being perfect, but about being attentive. Virtue grows through repetition, not idealization. When this principle deepens, something changes in how we see success. Success ceases to be what the world applauds and becomes what the conscience recognizes. This shift is subtle but transformative. It removes the weight of constant comparison and restores the dignity of one's own path. And as virtue becomes the center, a new layer of reflection emerges. Because if living well involves acting rightly in the world, then it is impossible to ignore the moment in which those actions occur. Where, after all, does virtue manifest? Always now. Always in the present instant. And it is at this point that attention begins to turn towards something even more essential. The power of the present moment. There is something deeply liberating in the way Marcus Aurelius calls us back to the now. In Meditations, he does not speak of the present moment as an abstract idea, but as the only real space where life happens. Past and future exist in the mind. Action, virtue, and choice always occur in this instant. When this truth settles, the mind slows down, not because problems disappear, but because they stop multiplying unnecessarily. I notice how much energy we lose by living outside the present. We revisit what has already passed, trying to rewrite scenes that cannot be changed. Or we anticipate future scenarios that may never happen. Marcus Aurelius saw this as a form of inner waste. He reminds us, with firmness and gentleness, that suffering twice, once in imagination and once in reality, is not wisdom, it is distraction. Stoic philosophy proposes an active presence, not a passive one. Being in the present moment is not disengaging from life. It is engaging fully with what is before us. Washing a dish, writing a message, listening to someone, everything can be done with awareness or on autopilot. The difference between these two postures completely changes the quality of experience. The present, when lived attentively, becomes lighter and fuller. Marcus Aurelius practiced this by fragmenting time. Instead of thinking of life as an overwhelming whole, he brought focus to immediate action. What needs to be done now? What is the next correct gesture? This method reduces anxiety and increases clarity. When the mind tries to carry the weight of the entire future, it becomes exhausted. When it occupies itself only with the present, it becomes organized. A simple yet powerful exercise is anchoring attention in the body, noticing the breath, the contact of the feet with the ground, the rhythm of one's own movement. This is not spiritual escape, it is a return to concrete reality. Marcus Aurelius understood that awareness begins with the simple. The further we drift from the present, the more space we give to useless thoughts and dysregulated emotions. Living in the now also transforms how we deal with mistakes. The past cannot be changed, but it can be understood. The present is the place of adjustment. Instead of mentally punishing ourselves for something that has already happened, Stoic practical philosophy invites us to ask, what can I do differently now? This question restores power to the conscience and prevents regret from becoming a prison. There is a particular serenity in accepting that this moment is enough, not in the sense of resignation but of reality. Marcus Aurelius knew that the restless mind always wants more time, more guarantees, more control. Conscious presence dissolves this urgency. When I am fully in the now, I am not late for life. I am exactly where I should be. In everyday life, this manifests in very practical ways. Eating without distraction, listening without preparing a response, working without getting lost in 1,000 mental tabs open at once. These small gestures strengthen awareness and train focus. The mind gradually learns not to flee constantly from the present moment. This presence also deepens emotional life. When I am attentive, I perceive nuances that previously went unnoticed. A tone of voice, a silence, a subtle shift in mood. This improves relationships and reduces conflict. Marcus Aurelius saw attention as a form of respect, toward oneself and toward others. And the more this practice strengthens, the clearer it becomes that living in the now is not merely an individual matter. We are always in relationship, with people, with situations, with the world around us. To be present is also to be available to understand the other. And it is precisely here that reflection begins to expand into something greater, human nature and life in society. Understanding human and social nature. One of the things that most strikes me in meditations is how Marcus Aurelius never forgets that the human being is, above all, a social being. Even as emperor with absolute power, he reminded himself daily that living well is not an isolated act. We live in relationship. And understanding human nature is one of the keys to reducing internal and external conflict. Much suffering arises when we expect from people what they are unable to give. Marcus Aurelius observed human behavior with remarkable lucidity. He knew that people act driven by ignorance, fear, desire, or inner confusion, not necessarily by conscious malice. This understanding does not justify everything, but it broadens perspective. When I grasp this, I stop personalizing certain behaviors. Another's offense often says more about their internal state than about me. Stoic philosophy teaches us that reacting with anger to another's ignorance is like getting angry at a stone for being in the way. It makes no sense. The stone is there because that is its nature. People err because they have not yet understood something. This view completely changes how we deal with difficult interactions. Instead of feeding resentment, we cultivate discernment. In daily life, this is extremely practical. Think of workplaces, families, traffic, social media. How often do we exhaust ourselves trying to correct others' behavior? Marcus Aurelius would remind us to focus on our role, acting with justice, clarity, and firmness, without absorbing external chaos. This is not passivity, it is emotional maturity. There is also a very strong ethical dimension in this view. Marcus Aurelius believed that we were made to cooperate, that acting against others is, in a sense, acting against human nature itself. This idea brings responsibility to our actions. Every gesture, every word contributes to the quality of the social fabric. Living virtuously is not only an individual benefit, it is a silent service to the whole. An exercise that helps greatly is replacing immediate judgment with the question, what might be happening inside this person? This simple shift in perspective reduces inner aggression. It does not mean tolerating abuse, but it prevents us from becoming emotionally hostage to others' behavior. Reason enters as a mediator between impulse and response. Marcus Aurelius also speaks about accepting that not everyone will think like us, nor act rationally, and that is fine. The problem begins when we demand that the world match our internal expectations. Stoic philosophy proposes coexistence based on realism and awareness, not fragile idealizations. This understanding deepens empathy while also strengthening boundaries. To understand the other does not mean to erase oneself. It means acting with clarity without losing humanity. This combination is rare but transformative. Relationships become less reactive and more stable when we stop expecting human perfection. Over time, this broader view reduces unnecessary conflict. We realize that many battles are not worth the emotional cost. Choosing where to invest energy is a form of practical wisdom. Marcus Aurelius did this constantly to preserve his own mind amid an empire under constant tension. And when this social understanding deepens, a new question arises. If the world is unpredictable and people are imperfect, how can we maintain inner stability in the face of life's inevitable difficulties? It is at this point that reflection naturally leads us to the idea of adversity, not as an enemy but as a teacher of inner growth. Resilience in the face of adversity. Few things reveal as much about us as the way we respond to adversity. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. In Meditations, he does not treat challenges as deviations from the path, but as an integral part of the human experience. Life, for him, was not something to be controlled but something to be crossed with dignity. This shift in perspective transforms adversity from enemy into teacher. Over time, I have learned that suffering intensifies when we resist what is already happening. Stoic philosophy proposes something counterintuitive. Acceptance is not surrender, it is stopping the fight against the inevitable. When something difficult happens, the first question is not, why me? But, how can I move through this in the best possible way? This simple shift restores strength to the conscience. Marcus Aurelius saw every obstacle as an opportunity to exercise virtue. Injustice tests justice. Difficulty tests courage. Loss tests temperance. Nothing happens in vain from the perspective of inner growth. Even the harshest experiences carry the potential for learning, as long as the mind is open to reflection rather than constant revolt. In daily life, this appears in very concrete ways. A professional failure, for example, can generate bitterness or maturity. The difference lies in interpretation. Stoicism teaches us to separate the event from the narrative we build around it. The event is what it is. The narrative can be adjusted. And it is in this adjustment that emotional resilience strengthens. A practical exercise that helps greatly in such moments is to ask, what is this teaching me about myself? Not as self-accusation but as self-knowledge. Marcus Aurelius wrote to identify his own weaknesses, not to punish himself but to evolve. Adversity functions as a mirror, revealing parts of us that comfort usually conceals. There is also a strong aspect of mental preparation in Stoicism. Marcus Aurelius reflected in advance on possible difficulties, not to suffer prematurely, but to avoid being emotionally caught off guard. When the mind rehearses acceptance, the impact lessens. This practice creates inner stability that does not depend on favorable circumstances. Stoic resilience is not emotional hardening, it is conscious flexibility, the ability to adapt without breaking. When I stop demanding that life be different from what it is, I spend less energy complaining and more energy acting. This posture changes the relationship with suffering. It ceases to be only pain and becomes transformation. Marcus Aurelius also reminds us that everything that happens is transient. Even the most difficult phases pass. This awareness does not eliminate pain, but it prevents despair. Knowing that nothing is eternal, not even suffering, brings a deep calm. Impermanence, when well understood, becomes an ally of resilience. In the midst of adversity, we often lose our sense of proportion. Everything seems larger than it really is. Stoicism invites us to widen our perspective, to observe life as a whole, not merely as an isolated episode. This expansion restores balance to the mind and prevents a difficult moment from defining our entire identity. And when this resilience begins to consolidate, something even deeper reveals itself. Because as we move through challenges with awareness, we realize that we are not separate from life. We are part of something larger. A broader order, a flow that includes us. It is at this point that reflection expands beyond the individual and touches a sense of belonging to the whole. Connection with the universe and universal reason, logos. Throughout meditations, it becomes clear that Marcus Aurelius did not view life as a random sequence of events. For him, there was an underlying order, an intelligence that permeates everything, what the Stoics called universal reason or logos. This is not a religious concept in a dogmatic sense, but a profound perception of belonging. We are parts of a greater whole, and understanding this changes the way we move through existence. When this idea begins to settle in, something softens internally. Life stops feeling like a personal battle against the world. It becomes a dialogue with it. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that everything that happens is embedded in a larger order, even when our understanding is limited. This acceptance does not eliminate pain, but it removes the burden of constant rebellion against reality. Here, Stoic philosophy reaches its most spiritual dimension. To live according to nature means to align thought, action, and intention with this universal order. Not to resist the flow of life unnecessarily, but to act consciously within it. This alignment generates a sense of inner harmony that is difficult to explain, yet easy to feel once experienced. I notice this in moments when I stop asking, "Why did this happen?" and begin asking, "How does this fit into my path?" This shift in perspective does not demand ready-made answers. It requires trust. Marcus Aurelius knew that not everything needs to be understood in order to be accepted. Sometimes wisdom lies in cooperating with what is, rather than fighting the inevitable. The Logos also reminds us of the interconnectedness of all things. Nothing exists in isolation. Our actions reverberate. Our choices affect the whole. This awareness expands our sense of responsibility while simultaneously diminishing the ego. We are not the center of the universe, but we are a meaningful part of it. This realization brings humility and purpose at the same time. In daily life, this connection manifests in small gestures, taking care of what surrounds us, treating people with respect, acting with integrity even when no one is watching. Marcus Aurelius saw this as a form of cooperation with the natural order. To live virtuously was, for him, a way of being in tune with the whole. There is also a deep relief in realizing that we are not alone in carrying the weight of life. When we accept that we are part of something greater, the need for control loosens its grip. The mind relaxes. The heart opens. Life begins to be lived with more trust and less rigidity. This conscious surrender is not passivity, it is wisdom. Marcus Aurelius wrote to remind himself that everything that happens is transient, but the way we live each moment leaves a mark. Aligning with the logos is not an escape from reality, it is a full inhabiting of it. It is recognizing that every moment carries an opportunity to act with awareness, dignity, and balance. This perspective broadens the notion of purpose. The meaning of life is not found in isolated grand achievements, but in the way we participate in the flow of existence. Every just action, every conscious choice, every moment of presence contributes to this greater order. Living this way does not eliminate challenges, but it gives them meaning. And when this understanding integrates into everyday experience, something closes and, at the same time, opens. A cycle of reflection comes to an end. The possibility of living all of this in practice begins. Because in the end, wisdom is only complete when it descends from the mind into real life. That is where teachings cease to be words and become a path. Life in practice, a story of application and conclusion. I clearly remember an ordinary day, one of those that don't seem important until something shifts inside. I woke up late, my phone already full of notifications, my mind restless before my body even left the bed. Everything seemed to demand an immediate response. Hurry, expectation, pressure. It was in this banal scenario that I realized how far I had drifted from myself. And, curiously, it was right there that the teachings of Marcus Aurelius stopped being philosophy and became life. On the way to work, a simple situation threw me off balance. A delay that wasn't my fault, a sharp response from someone I didn't expect it from. The impulse came quickly, irritation, judgment, that automatic urge to react. But something different happened. I paused. I remembered what was under my control, not the event but my response. I breathed. And in that small space between stimulus and reaction, I chose a different posture. As I walked, I thought about impermanence. That situation, which felt so significant in that moment, would also pass, just as so many others already had. The weight lessened. Not because the problem was immediately resolved, but because I stopped feeding it internally. My mind became clearer. My body lighter. It was as if I had removed fuel from a fire before it could spread. Throughout the day, other opportunities for practice emerged. A difficult decision, a delicate conversation, a silent ethical choice that no one would applaud. In each of them, the question returned, is this aligned with virtue? Am I acting from awareness or from uncontrolled emotion? I didn't always get it right, but even in my mistakes there was something new, perception. And that alone was already inner growth. In a quiet moment, I realized something profound. I didn't need to win the day. I only needed to live it well. To be present. To do what was in front of me with attention and dignity. Marcus Aurelius spoke about this constantly. Not carrying an entire lifetime on your shoulders, just this moment. Just this action. Just now. As I observed the people around me, I was reminded of human nature. Each person dealing with their own internal battles, often invisible. That understanding brought empathy. Less judgment. More humanity. I realized that acting with justice and understanding was not weakness, it was inner strength. A quiet strength but a stable one. At the end of the day, something was different. The problems hadn't disappeared. Life remained imperfect. But there was a sense of alignment. A calm that didn't come from circumstances, but from inner posture. I had cooperated with life instead of fighting it. I had accepted the flow without abandoning responsibility for my choices. That was when I truly understood what Marcus Aurelius meant by universal reason. When I act with awareness, virtue, and presence, I am not isolated. I am in tune with something greater, with the order of life, with the logos. This perception doesn't solve everything, but it gives meaning to everything. And now I ask you with honesty and calm, where have you been wasting energy trying to control what does not depend on you? Which emotions have been governing your choices without you noticing? What would change in your life if you chose to act with more awareness, even in small things? Perhaps the transformation you seek is not in changing the world around you, but in reorganizing the world within you. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius does not offer empty promises. It offers a path, a daily invitation to virtuous living, self-mastery, and inner harmony. If this content resonated with you, take it into your daily life. Start small. One extra pause. One less reaction. One choice more aligned with who you want to be. This is how philosophy stops being theory and becomes practice. And if you want to continue exploring deep ideas about consciousness, inner growth, and ancient wisdom applied to modern life, subscribe to the channel The Philosophy of Awareness and the Soul. Turn on notifications and walk with me in this process of reflection, presence, and quiet transformation. Life does not ask for haste. It asks for awareness.